Pokemon games have literally been with me since I was a child. I grew up alongside them, and they've essentially been just a part of every single moment in my life. I could essentially break down the chapters of my life based on the Pokemon game that I was playing. That's how integrated these games have been with my childhood. And the trend of playing all of the Pokemon games has absolutely continued as I've gotten older, and they've grown up alongside me. Since the Nintendo Switch era, I've still continued to play the newer releases, but I don't know if you've played them lately, but they are not the cream of the crop by any means. And after playing these newer games, it just made me love the older generations that much more. And then you combine that with a nostalgia, and I found myself recently just wanting to go back and relive some of the classics. And we're in the middle of the retro handheld scene exploding right now, so I wanted to see if it was possible to perfectly play these older Pokemon games, but with a modern twist. So my grandma actually bought me the Gameboy Advance SP back in like 2005, and it came with Fire Red, and for whatever reason she chose to buy me the Pokemon game with the console, or maybe it was like a bundle, but weirdly enough, that decision to pick that game in particular changed so much for me and my trajectory as a child. Not only was Fire Red my first video game ever, but it was also something that helped me build friendships with other kids who also were interested in Pokemon, or maybe they didn't have a grandma like mine who bought them the console, so we'd share it and we could both play. And I actually have the original Game Boy Advance SP that my grandma bought me, and you can see just how much use this thing got out of me for when I was younger. I don't have any other device that just got this much use, and honestly, it still holds up even today. Nintendo were absolutely in their bag when it came to clamshell devices, and this alongside the DS just established such an incredible lineup of handhelds for any consumer to buy at the time. And even to this day, I mean, these buttons still hold up really well. They're a little bit clickier, but also not too loud, and still just as satisfying to press nowadays as it was back in the day. And because it's a clamshell, you have the option to just close it up, and it kind of acts as a case in and of itself by just closing the device. And the clamshell form factor from my childhood saved my screen. You can see the scratches on the very front that were gonna end up being on the screen had this just been an original GBA. And I think that's probably why the screen on this is still so intact, and you know, it's barely touched. Now you might be thinking, great, you've got an original SP, you wanted to play the original Pokemon games, the search is done. You don't even have to look for a device, you've got the original hardware right here. And at first that seems like a great idea until you realize that while the SP is a beautifully designed little handheld, there are a few things that definitely take away from the gaming experience, especially in, 2025. The SP had two different models, the AGS 001 and the AGS 101, and the main distinction between the two was just the screen quality and brightness. So the 101 had a much brighter screen, and unfortunately I own the 001, which is the dimmer screen. And on top of that, my hands have thankfully grown since I was 5 years old, so that means that this device, while it's a great little form factor, doesn't really fit my hands nearly as well, so I get kind of crampy if I was to actually try and use this to relive the classics. And all of this just means that 20 years later, I have to finally retire my original Game Boy Advance SP that my grandmother so generously bought me. But now that means that the great search must begin. Since we're closing up this chapter of the original Game Boy Advance SP, something's got to take its place, and it's got to play the original Game Boy Advance Pokemon games flawlessly. And the reason why I'm focusing on the Pokemon GBA games in particular is because those will give us access to an even larger library, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the video. I'm trying to find a device that will play these games perfectly and become the ultimate Pokemon handheld. And like I mentioned in the intro, we're right in the middle of the retro handheld space popping off, so that means we've got plenty of options on the market to choose from. And if you've been a fan of the retro handheld space for a while, you've I've realized that there's probably way too many options at this point. It can actually be really overwhelming for any consumer now to figure out and find a device that works for them, because there's literally just so many devices on the market, it's hard to choose from. Since we're specifically playing 2D Pokemon games from the GBA, we can essentially just throw out all of the expensive options. That means the Retroid Pocket 5 is off limits. The Odin-2 or Odin-2 Portal or any of those higher end emulation devices are all just basically getting dropped off the list, because we want something that fits this retro vibe, but isn't trying too hard to be a little bit modern. We're not gonna be playing Switch games. And fortunately, that's gonna leave us with a lot of more budget options. So things that aren't $200 just to play some old games. Right away, I considered a vertical device like the RG40XXV. This thing's got a fantastic 4-inch screen. It's a nice size as well for medium to large hands, so it should be really comfortable if we were to use this. And overall, for 60 bucks, you're getting something that excels in just so many different systems, but that also means that it's not going to be perfect in a couple of areas that we're looking for when it comes to these Pokemon games. The screen dimensions don't really line up well for GBA, and while it's an absolutely playable experience, you're still going to get some bezels on the top and bottom of the screen, which means this thing's also now going to be off the list. Next up, I thought about getting the Powkiddy V10, which is pretty dang good for GBA. It's got a 2x upscaled resolution from the GBA, sitting at 480 by 320, so the games are going to look perfect alongside the pixels. It's also extremely affordable. This thing is probably the cheapest one I considered when going on this great search. At $40, you can get all of this in your pocket. And that's so much cheaper than like a $70 AAA game. It's actually ridiculous. But this device is just a little bit too small. I couldn't actually make this thing like my dedicated Pokemon device with it being so tiny. I mean, I didn't mind having a smaller device, but this one is clearly just trying to be a little bit more pocketable, and it's going to take away a lot from the ergonomics. And at that point, I'd probably rather just play the original GBA SP. But we are making progress here, narrowing down the list. And next up, I saw the Anbernic RG35XX SP, which is just such a mouthful. But this thing actually at first glance just seems like the winner. It's recreating the GBA SP form factor, but just on a little bit of a bigger size. So my complaints about this original GBA SP that I had from my grandma being too small doesn't really exist anymore on this device. It's got a nice and updated modern screen. The controls are solid. They're a little bit clickier and louder than the original SP, but close enough to get the job done. And then you can also get the original silver color, which makes it look identical to the SP. And the only thing that might not align with what we're looking for is just the screen dimensions. Ironically, this thing doesn't have the perfect dimensions for GBA, so it actually needs a bezel or an overlay that will squeeze at the bottom, and you're not getting a perfect upscaled resolution from the Game Boy Advance games. But with the overlay, it still looks pretty dang convincing. So the RG SP was looking like the winner of this race. It was pretty much hitting every single checkbox until Anbernic decided to do what they do best and release one more device. But this isn't just any normal random new device. This thing actually is a one-for-one replica, it feels like, of the original Game Boy Advance, and it is called the RG34XX. This is just a Game Boy Advance, but with a modern screen and modern controls. Straight out of the box, you get the device, a screen protector, and a charging cable. And the best thing about the 34XX is that it's got a perfect 3x upscaled screen resolution from the GBA, sitting at 720 by 480, and a slightly bigger 3.2-inch IPS screen. And this means GBA games look insane on this device. It is taking the original games and just upscaling them in the exact resolution that you would want. I decided to go with the black color because I wanted the screen to pop a little bit more and one of the colors to stand out. There's plenty of other, colors on this model. You could go with the original indigo, which is really popular, or I believe they have a glacier model too for some people who loved that of the GBA. But in my taste, I just wanted something that was a little bit more dull on the shell so that the colors stand out. And the build quality of this thing is basically one for one on the original GBA. So if you have one, pick that up and you'll pretty much get the same experience as you would on the RG34XX. I will say though that if you intend on playing other Game Boy Advance games besides just Pokemon, the D-pad on this thing is kind of trash, I'm not gonna lie. It's just super mushy, and it's just like the original GBA, which did not have perfect controls by any means. So when I'm playing games, I actually get a lot of false inputs and false diagonals, so it's just really inaccurate. Thankfully, we're only playing Pokemon games, and I actually find that the mushier D-pad is a little bit more comfortable for me. I usually prefer like clickier D-pads, but this one absolutely does the job fine for Pokemon games, and it actually feels kind of nice having a mushier D-pad for just Pokemon games. But if you want to play anything else like platformers, this D-pad is kind of trash. One thing I found weird though about the build quality was just on the left and right side of the device, where the exterior shell kind of concaves inwards and has this weird little bump. The plastic is really sharp. I don't notice it at all when I'm playing games because my hands are stationary, but if you're readjusting your grip and it does rub against that plastic, it can be pretty uncomfortable. So I wanted to mention that, especially for those of you who might actually spend some money on this device. But we're here for the nostalgia and for the perfect Pokemon device. And ladies and gentlemen, I think that we have actually found the device of our dreams. This is the first retro handheld that I've used that actually made me forget that I'm using a retro handheld emulation machine, because it looks identical to a GBA, and the extra buttons on the right side also blend in to match the shell, which is a genius design. So when you're out playing this thing, it genuinely just feels like an original GBA, and if I was to see this out and about, I would just think it was a Game Boy Advance or maybe a modded one once I saw the screen, but I wouldn't be able to tell if it was the original just off of a quick glance. Now, I'm also really excited to show you what I've done with the device on the software side of things. First off, like almost every other retro handheld, I installed a custom firmware called MUOS, and I followed the Retro Game Core guide, so if you want to do this as well, it's actually pretty easy to install it. And replacing the stock firmware on any of these retro handhelds will make a world of a difference and just create a smoother experience for you to access your ROMs. But because this is a Pokemon specific device, I also went ahead and added a bunch of custom themes and actually customized one that fits the Pokemon theme that we're going for. This one is called CantOS, which is just a beautifully designed custom theme that I found on their website, and it takes images from the Fire Red and Leaf Green games and makes them your home menu. The only problem I found with the original theme was that it just didn't scale perfectly for the RG34XX, so I had to go into Photoshop and expand the images and then add that and recompress the theme and change it up a little bit. I also went ahead and did a couple of tweaks too. I changed the boot logo to just have a Pokeball where it's nice and simple. And then after tinkering in Photoshop and messing with the theme, this is the final result. You've got Pokemon everywhere and it looks like it's just a Pokemon device. It's crazy how this turned out. And now we can finally discuss the games, okay, and why when it comes to a Pokemon device, I specifically decided to go after perfect GBA emulation. Personally, my favorite Pokemon games aren't even the ones on the GBA. Even though it's my first ever video game, I actually prefer the Pokemon DS games. But if you've watched my previous video about the DS, you'll realize that there's literally no device on the market that can emulate DS games nearly as good as the original hardware. And I'm sure some of you are wondering, okay, why did you buy a separate device just to play GBA games that aren't even your favorite Pokemon games? And while I think that's a fantastic point, and I'm also an idiot, I do want to remind you that there is such a thing right now as Pokémon Rom Hacks. ROM hacks, especially these past few years, have gotten crazy good, and most of Pokemon ROM hacks are actually created from the Game Boy Advance ROM Fire Red. So almost all of the Pokemon ROM hacks, with obviously a few exceptions, are made fine-tuned for the Game Boy Advance. And on this device, I'm only keeping Pokemon games. So if I was to have a machine that could play, you know, any Pokemon games, I would want it to be the GBA games, because now I've got access to so much more than just the original Nintendo Pokemon games. And a lot of these are great additions to the Pokemon franchise, and some of them, like Pokemon Unbound, actually feel like an original Game Freak game. They're that good. There's just so many Pokemon ROM hacks, so if you haven't tapped into this world, I absolutely recommend that you do. It's actually crazy that a device like this exists and can pull on our nostalgic heartstrings as well as this thing does. And I think if I was to hand this to my younger child self, he'd probably freak out and then just assume that this is a baseline Nintendo product from the future because it's just decked out with only Pokemon. To have access to these Pokemon games and to play them in this nostalgic form factor that makes me forget that I'm even emulating in the first place has been an awesome experience, and one that I'm really just happy to share with you. Setting this thing up was a ton of fun, and I hope to see more handhelds come out in the future that focus on specific consoles rather than just like a jack of all trades. But I kind of understand that that might not be possible, because even with this device, I mean, I don't know how they're not getting in trouble for how close this looks to the original GBA. I'm sure Nintendo doesn't care at this point. But that's about it, guys. I felt like sharing and yapping about this specific Pokemon device for the entire video and explaining my process and the journey just to get to this little device that can fit into my pocket. Thank you all so much for 2,500 subs. We're a quarter of the way to 10K, which is sick. I'm trying to make like also different types of videos and newer kinds as well as we progress with the content. I'm hoping that the channel and the types of videos that I make can also continue to evolve, but it's been such an explosive start for this channel. We started it, I think, back in like December or November. So thank you so much for anybody who has been tuning in, checking out the videos, and of course, giving me your time. I truly appreciate it. And I hope that I'll see you in the next video. See you later.